an interview 2 days ago on O'Brien's show in LBC. Khan comes in and he's asked a question that, listen, Starmer is your friend. How are you going to deal with him when he is now sounding like he's Enoch Powell and all this about immigration? And one of the responses that Khan brings out, and what LBC, if you go up a little bit, says there, I think, Sadiq Khan has a lovely stat that says dispels the ideas that migrants are sponges or skivers. First of all, note that the use of the word migrants there, but then we go in and listen to the actual the statement from. We get it there.
A skilled migrant will contribute on average £16,000 a year towards our economy, and that's when you include the public services he or she may use. By the way, compare that to a Brit skilled worker, that's £800 minus the public services they use. And here's the lovely stat. A skilled migrant's family will contribute to the British economy £12,000 a year. That's even when you take away public services they use. A British skilled worker's family takes from the economy £4,400 when you include public services they use. So the idea that skilled migrants are sponges or skivers isn't the case.
Right.
Well, that can't possibly be true.
That sounds like you might as well remove the whole native population. What the hell does that mean?
Well, that's the first point. If foreign workers and skilled migrants are absolutely so brilliant, then all we need to do is just get rid of everybody. Get rid of everybody that is a Brit, a home state individual, because clearly we're such a drain on society. But the figures and facts are just absolute nonsense.
It just stands to reason it cannot possibly be. I mean, I know we're running a deficit, but we're not running that sort of deficit.
Yeah, and so everybody who's listened to this has gone a bit viral. His statement, I think, that had something like 2 million views on this. I think we start obviously seeing the claim. And this is the main claim that he's made. Skilled migrants' family will contribute $12,000 a year to the economy, where a British skilled workers' family takes from the economy £4,400 was the number he used. So there's a £16,400 difference between a British skilled workers' family and otherwise. Now, I'm going to talk about how we got to these numbers just to show how poor at maths he is on terms of this. But Connor... I was speaking to Connor about this as well. He's had an analysis of it. He talks about only 15% of British post-Brexit migrants can principally work. Of those with skilled worker visas, the OBR, this is one of the things, the OBR only a few months ago admitted that 60% make less than the median salary, 50% of skilled workers earn less than half the average salary, costing British taxpayers £151,000 each by the time they retire. He goes on to talk about other numbers, life expectancy to 81, they cost us 460,000. And if they go up to 100, they're costing us £1 million. There's further studies on there. Then Wolf, not me, World by Wolf, just shows that the skilled migrants make up a tiny fraction of the number of visas that are actually issued each year. I'm doing a little bit of work on this at the moment myself.
Really, like he's just being incredibly selective of who he picks out of the migrant lot. So, for example, when I was in the city, I mean, you'd walk through one of the big investment banks, and it would be uncommon to find, say, a whole table of French analysts, or
absolutely Bank Paribas, if you ever worked in there, as I've done for a while,
or a table of Korean quants or something like that. So it'd be quite, and typically what would happen is the whole team would move from one bank in one country to another London bank. Now, those people, I don't think we mind that immigration, because they come over, they earn an enormous amount, and they pay an enormous amount of taxes, and then eventually they go home again. It's fine.
Yeah.
Now, so if you want to make them your example of immigration, then fine. Of course, they're going to be contributing a lot of money, but the vast amount of immigration is people who don't contribute anything.
Well, the point that he's raising at the moment, and I'll go towards this on the end, is because Keir Starmer is saying skilled workers in his recent speech. We're going to bring down the numbers of skilled workers that have arrived in here, particularly we're taking away the visas of those in care homes. And so this argument now is...
Oh, well, if you're stretching...
That's not a skilled worker, that's wiping old women's arses and things.
Well, I would come to that in a moment.
And also, isn't dependent spelt with an E? I don't mean to be pedantic, but Is it?
I don't know. I can't spell.
Yeah, I think it is actually. I'm just seeing on that, but that's the Home Office's work. Now, so first of all, before I like to go out and criticise what is obviously the blatantly obvious,
Yes.
to clear of us, we want to try and work out where did he make such a statement from this. So initially, it wasn't obvious, and I'd forgotten about this report, and then I went, right, okay. I come across the Migration Advisory Committee annual report. There's some good people on it. Madeleine Sumption from Oxford Migration Trust. She's pretty reasonable, normally hot on the stats. But most of the Migration Advisory Committee, which is the committee that I advised Boris Johnson to actually establish during the Brexit campaign, and when I wrote the paper, a fair, flexible, forward-thinking immigration paper, was one that was supposed to be an organisation that looks at our economy, works out where the skills are needed. Do we need more bankers? Do we need more footballers playing for Man United that come abroad so that they can actually win? That sort of thing.
I think no to all of those, but we do need a better class of politician.
And so we were looking at that, and instead they filled it with a whole load of people that when I look at them, is their reports and stats always favour the migrant coming in. No Paul Collier from Cambridge, for example, who wrote Home State, Host State, which is a vital piece of book, a vital book if you want to understand the whole arguments. And when you go through this, and I'm not going to tell the audience to read it completely. They can if they want, and I'm certainly not going to read it here. This is the report that it goes through, and here are the individuals: Professor Brian Bell, Dina Keewan, Sergi Padras Prado, Madeleine Sumption, Joe Swaffield. Most of those are utterly left in terms of the way that they assess it, and they try and justify their arguments about mass migration through the Migration Advisory Committee in reports like this. And I broke it down, so that's where the paper came from, that he obviously is referring to. And one of the key findings within the government, on page 28 at the bottom, if you read this here, it says, it provides our estimates of government expenditure at individual levels for main applicants, adult dependents, child dependents on the skilled worker visa. And here's the key point: in comparison to the equivalent UK-born adult, not the comparison to an equivalent skilled worker UK-born adult.
Right, so it's a complete lie.
So it's a complete lie.
He's basically comparing working class people with middle class people, and sort of.
Yes, that's right. He's comparing a banker at BNP Paribas to someone who's working in a factory.
And does he know that, or has he just been badly advised by his sycophant?
Well, this is the report. This is the MAC report. This is page 28.
He isn't conscientious enough to actually read the report.
Oh, I don't for a think for a minute.
He probably just told some underling that he was going on the radio, put out some stats.
Right. Yeah.
Now, interestingly enough, this is what the Migration Advisory Committee says are skilled worker volumes for 2022-2023. And a fascinating element about that is they're saying there's 170,300 main applicants, children and dependents come in that, and we've only got 329,200, of which he says they make a contribution of £12,000, which is obviously the tax that they supposedly pay.
Well, for a start, that's out of 1.4 million. So there's 1.1 million additional immigrants on top of that number.
Absolutely. So there again, another blatant use of facts to try and justify his argument. But we'll look at that, and the Migration Advisory Committee, when they're dealing with this, when they're saying the analysis of skilled workers and UK adults to ensure consistency, I don't understand how they can say that for a minute, that it's consistency. But they also do say it's a specific point in time. They're analysing the 329,200 skilled workers and the cost to the government on the day that they're here, or this year, but they're doing the cost to skilled workers, UK workers across their lifetime. So the skilled workers, they're saying, do not claim benefits now when they get here. They're young, they're virile workers. They don't get pensions like the Brits in there at all, so they're not claiming off healthcare because they're getting older. But at that time, they're young, virile, paying taxes. They're not saying what happens to them over the period of the time of them living here, or when they can claim benefits once they get indefinite leave to remain after 3 years. So again, they've cherry-picked the numbers. And one of the things I put on my tweet here is the 12K is just wrong. It would mean those 329,000 is actually 172,000 would need an average of 82,500 a year to actually make those numbers work. Bearing in mind, the vast majority of the skilled workers that they call skilled are care home recipients.
Right, and in what sense, though, that's my question, this term skilled, it seems to have been stretched out of all proportion. I would think that a skilled person would be a person that was specifically trained in a complicated trade.
Yeah, electrical engineer or something.
So, right. At the very least, someone that was maybe had a postgraduate qualification or something.
Whereas what I see a lot in my local area is obviously immigrant people shepherding around people with mental infirmities of some sort. I see a lot of that.
Right, that's unskilled workers.
Yes, but from what you just said, they go in the skilled worker.
Yes, and what's interesting, I mean, now you've got it, perhaps I would have been better at pulling that out. Actually, the Migration Advisory Committee tries to assess the question of what is skilled workers. And they include skilled workers as chefs, those working in the construction industry.
Possibly.
Yeah, it depends which part of the construction industry. People working in care homes.
Nope.
So they do this list and then they go, oh, well, perhaps the use of the word skilled worker is not really the best definition of what we're looking at. Perhaps we should look at educational or academic equivalents, but they're not doing that. They're literally saying everybody that comes here is a skilled worker.
It seems to me they're saying everyone that is a worker is a skilled worker.
Yes.
I mean, well, I suppose a waiter is not a skilled worker, but a chef is. So is that right?
And they're the ones that defined what is a skilled worker, because they're the Migration Advisory Committee. They advise what the categories are. They're used by the government to implement it into visa policy. So when someone makes an application for a business for somebody who's doing a chef at your kebab bar, he's a skilled worker because he can cut a bit of...
So this makes it even more worrying to me that they're obviously making it as broad as they possibly can.
Yep.
And yet even then, out of 1.4 million people that arrived, only 300,000 of them get classified as skilled. So the other 1.1...
That's including their families. It's actually 170,300.
Fair point. Okay, so of 1.4 million people came here, even 1.2 million could not meet this incredibly broad definition of what skilled is.
And one of the things they're saying I think is interesting. You know, there's that stereotypical kind of joke argument that the good thing about immigration is that there's a variety of foreign food. That's really the only argument a lot of people can think of. But even that is breaking down. Because the first generation that come here, they run the Indian restaurants or whatever, but increasingly the kids who are born here, they have other ambitions. They want to be lawyers or doctors or something like that. And so then the consequence is they're having to import chefs or whatever, or workers from
into their restaurants
in order to sustain the restaurants.
Yes, and that's where they get the qualification that they're a skilled worker, and they make the application for a skilled workers visas. But as I said, actually, here we are. The tax there is paying $25,617 per worker. That's the tax fraud scam. The dependent scam is that, you know, they're saying that the kids pay no tax, but schools, NHS, housing benefit, none of these actually apply to them. But of course, over the course of the lifetime, it may do.
One of the things I find so confusing about this, and I don't mean to big up Finland where I live, but what used to happen in Finland, I don't know if it still does, but 20 years ago it did, it was quite rare, unless you were applying for a job in Helsinki, because lots of people want to live in Helsinki, that there'd even be other applicants for your job. So if you wanted to be a vicar, what would happen is that the government would work out how many vicars must we train a year to replace those that retire. And then they would say, okay, this is how many we need. Therefore, there will be this many theology places available, funded by the government with a grant, at universities, and no more. And they did that pretty much with every single job. How many car mechanics do we need a year to replace retirement? This is how many car mechanics we will train a year, and no more.
Now, you see, when I wrote the paper that included the idea of a migration advisory committee exactly based on that. And there was a there was a slight extension to kind of copy some of the more positive aspects of Australia, where they have a similar situation where they work, admittedly, with business and trade unions and the NH to try and come a broader number. It's not exactly we need 100, because sometimes that's more difficult. Someone might die in a car accident tomorrow, but they had a broader range. Even that range, when I did it, showed that we could have a net migration of just 50,000 a year in terms of the way that we got. And that was actually then being covered by the number of people that died. So we've effectively moving towards a zero net population increase. Because we'd bring in enough people would die, and our population would actually level itself out. Now, of course, the argument about net migration is being driven by the Treasury. The Treasury has always said for many, many years that we've got to keep GDP up. We've got to compete with our other GDP partners. We've got to be in the top 7. Because if our GDP falls to such a low level, then the bond markets get concerned. They stop buying sterling. They stop buying our bonds. Our interest rates will rise. That will increase the cost of our energy, and we'd have mass inflation. So you've just got to keep pumping in population after population.
But other countries manage to cope without massive inflation and without having constant migration.
Exactly. And that's partly down to one of the areas where we've got, even going back to Tony Benn's arguments of socialism, where he said that we've got a low-skilled, low-wage economy. Part of Brexit was to try and drive us away from that and increase the skills and level, and we do that by reducing
And also
immigration.
It fails to understand, it's very short term, because it fails to understand that if you have a nation of strangers, as Tutia Keir has put it, then this leads to further economic problems in the long run, because social trust collapses. This causes prices to go up, for example, because you're concerned about stealing or whatever it happens to be. Yeah. So then you just have further problems which they're not thinking about. They're just thinking of a short-term economic model.
And I call this, the population growth that we've got is the population Ponzi scheme. Because as you increase the population, it's exactly your point. When you get a migration advisory committee, they can't turn around and work out we only need 50 deacons or 100 ballet dancers.
Human quantitative easing.
Because we've got so many coming out. And what I say there is, look, the UK comparison is saying non-UK workers arriving in 1 year versus entire adult population is like the Olympic sprinter is faster than your grandma.
How hard would it be to just say this is how many medical doctors we need to train a year, this is therefore how many, give or take, we will train?
I don't think it's that hard, but the government seems to say it's a massive problem, and they've been saying that for years, and that's one reason why Boris brought in the Boris wave, which, to be fair on Keir Starmer, so I'm going to run through some very quickly here, because looking at the time, because when I have a back-end discussion of this, here's another of their scams where they turn around and say the UK skilled worker takes very little of the government expenditure, 4,800 and 1,100 at the bottom for the whole family. But if you look at a UK-born adult, we're taking around 16,500 a year in terms of from the government. What they mention is that includes pensions.
Yeah,
it's what we get as a pension.
Right. Numbers have been fudged.
Yes, that's right. So it's old age pensioners we put into the system all our lives, but now we're a net drain.
So if you say that those that work for the government, which is what percent of the population? What percent of the population work for the government? Essentially civil servants, teachers, doctors. They all work for the government.
Wouldn't be surprised
off the top of my head.
Is it 20%?
Wouldn't be.
And then add the sort of 20% or something that are unemployed or not fully employed. Yep. So we're now on 40%. And then add those that take out more than they put in. Then you're probably dealing with a situation where about 50% of the population are actually sustaining everybody else.
Oh, at most, yeah.
And that's not sustainable, is it really?
No, I think someone has actually provided statistics that actually we now have a situation in this country where we have a less of the population providing for more.
Well, yeah, sure, but
something like 47% are paying for 53, and it's unsustainable.
But does that include the people that work for the state, who it used to be argued you shouldn't be allowed to vote if you work for the state because you are part of the state?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, but I knew that numbers were saying that we're in a level now where we can't sustain this, where more the people who are working in the contributory part of the economy is actually paying for those that are not, and it's less. I picked up on this one. That one, is it? There we are. I'm going to come on here. And this is why he's coming out making statements as Khan and O'Brien, is because they're now saying that Starmer has crossed the line even for Blue Labour. I know we're going to talk about it briefly, because they're pulling out statements that in the rivers of blood they found themselves strangers in their own country, and Starmer is saying we're risk of being an island of strangers. So even for Blue Labour, which is, I say it's Blue Labour, but it's actually Blue Labour is being run by a former communist, and he admits he was a former Gramsci and communist. And he views the whole of Blue Labour as an ability to be socially conservative and reducing immigration, but it's too far for them to recognise that.
What's so potent about this word stranger?
That's the interesting point. I don't...
Or there's nothing potent about it, and they just hope they can render it potent in order to manipulate people. I mean, we have people we know, friends and acquaintances, and we have strangers. Yep. And you can say that at an individual level, and presumably you can say that at a group level. I mean, I would say a group of Buddhists are strangers to me. I know very little about Buddhism. I mean...
And I think when Kit Powell was talking about this, we obviously had smaller communities that were very tight knit, and then we had individuals coming in. The stranger argument was actually there when Alfred used it in the Chronicles, where he talked about the strangers to the east coming in and bring them in. That's why we had to have Christianity, to actually develop them and bring them into our own Christianity. The idea of a stranger coming in has always been there. The question is whether that stranger itself is actually a danger or something of betterment. We all know someone who's come from a different country, different part of our own country, that might have actually benefited our own community, benefited our own family. But the point about this is whether the vast numbers of strangers can have that benefit anymore. And I think it's not about the individual per se, it's about the volume.
Yeah, but you can literally, if you read Frank Salter's book on genetic interests, you can calculate the number of strangers, the foreigners, that can come in from a specific country for it to be the equivalent of you losing a certain number of children in terms of the damage to your genetic interests. And this can be offset if, let's say, a Danish person comes to England, so a quite closely related person, and he comes up with an invention that's so fantastic that it's really useful for your society, and so then it can be offset. But that problem is always there, that you're being there's a word I'm not allowed to use, isn't it? Begins with R, but you're being that by people of a different group.
I'm saying this coming across the left. We're attacking the news agents here is Alf Dubs, who they always bring out. I have to admit, because he and his family obviously managed to survive Auschwitz and helped getting the kinder children across. So they always bring out Dubs on this. They brought him out in Brexit. They brought him out in Boris Johnson. Yep. And here he is and saying it's regrettable language. I'm unhappy senior politicians are using the language reminiscent of this. And then we come to...
The key takeaway being don't ever stop mass immigration, otherwise it will lead immediately to a Holocaust.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
No.
How manipulative.
Yeah. And I do not believe the Prime Minister would have wanted it to invoke Enoch Powell, his Labour MP, a lovely bloke, saying that Starmer's speechwriters had never heard of Enoch Powell's River of Blood speech. I find that absolutely nonsense.
Half the arguments the left ever make about Enoch Powell.
Exactly. That would they never ever understand.
Absurd. Enoch Powell, I should emphasise, did instruct his supporters to vote Labour in the 1974 general election.
Yes.
And it's been argued that is why Harold Wilson won, albeit with a tiny majority, or was it even a hung parliament, the 1974 general election. So he was for a period pro-Labour.
Well, look, that was a particular time in our history where there were clear differences on issues such as the European Union. Yes. If you looked at Labour at that time, they weren't really enamoured of the idea of joining the European Economic Community.
We talk about him next. I mean, yeah.
So there was these big, strong arguments that he made. And, of course, he was falling out of the Conservative Party at that time over this particular issue. And I didn't know that it was actually that was the reason that they thought that he'd won, the Labour Party had won.
There is people that certainly there are historians that have argued that, because he had such big support because of the '68 speech among working class people. He had such big support that they would do a lot of them would just do what he said. So it was, how should you, as my supporters, as Powerlights, vote? And if he said vote Labour, they would do it, and it was felt because it was so close.
Yeah, it was.
That would tip the balance.
Well, you've seen the mass attack on Keir Starmer, which I believe that the Khan massive mistakes that he made over the numbers is all about this particular speech that the Prime Minister had made, where he says, I believe in reducing... I'll play this very briefly, only just to listen to the tone of the voice of... actually, I've got to click for sound, have I?
It is right.
I just want you to listen to the tone of his voice.
and because it is what I believe in.
There you go. Look at that. Look
Let
at
me
his
put
eyes.
it this way. Nations depend on rules, fair rules. Sometimes they're written down, often they're not.
What's the key takeaway you're getting from this?
But either way, they give
Just look
shape
at-
to our...
It's Blair. He's being Blair. Even with the hand. Did you see the hands?
Exactly.
He has been round Blair's
That's
house.
right.
They've had a little snuggle, and then Blair has taught him and rehearsed him on how
Got
to
the
do
same
his
individual.
speech.
Look at his face. Look at the fact that
He's
that he
right.
does-
What is important is that we understand that we use our hands a lot when we talk to show how sincere
and in this
we
particular
are.
way, and look straight in, and then every now and again dip your chin and look to be able to and hear. But it's when he says, it's something I believe in. Look at the vacancy of his eyes.
Yes.
There's nothing there that he believes in at all, other than maintaining power for himself at all. And I just find that very interesting. But there's a more interesting point that I find fascinating about this whole
It's
speech.
Joe Biden to Tony Blair's Obama. I mean, Tony Blair is still in charge, and there's vacancy behind his eyes.
When you think about it, Blair is still there. He's behind him. You've got Mandelson as ambassador in the US, and Alistair Campbell is out there pontificating on his own podcast as the greatest.
Alistair Campbell couldn't find any reason to talk about this, though. He skipped it.
Oh, has he?
Yes, he skipped it. Yeah.
I didn't see that. My mate Starmer can't do that now. But what I want to say is, if Samson managed to get this right, this is something that I found really, really important for us to get. I've talked about how the numbers that the ONS, the OBR, the Migration Advisory Committee have been looking at, and why have we been accepting mass migration for a long time? And that's because the Treasury, on the main point, has been driving this agenda about growth and GDP, and we need, and there is evidence out there that more people you get in, you do increase GDP. But GNP per capita, actually how wealthy we are as individuals, has been on the decline now for the last 15 years. We're now in a worse state than we used to be up there at the top 5 GNP per capita. We're now sitting there around 30. The decline is dramatic, and people don't understand that for every percentage point, we're losing 100 to 500 pounds per person each year.
Standard of living is getting to the point where the standard of living is higher in Slovenia.
That's right.
Well,
someone's even talked about some African countries getting close to us now. I'm not sure that's entirely right when we look at Ghana and Nigeria, but certainly their economies are growing on GNP per capita terms than they are perhaps on GDP.
Yep.
So here we have that argument, and then
Can I ask a question? Excuse my ignorance, but GNP is the standard of living of ordinary people.
That's correct.
So why is GDP, gross domestic product, why is that considered more important? Really, the important thing is the standard of living of the people. Why?
Not according to the financial markets. The financial markets look at you and turn around and say GDP is like how expensive is your house? Is it going up really well? You bought it for $1 million. Is it worth 1.2 next year? Is it worth 1.4? That's the net income of the country. What are we producing, allegedly? So it doesn't matter that we might have a few billionaires increasing their share prices in terms of their pensions. But as long as it looks good and it's growing, your house and your wealth is growing as a nation. So they say that's important because then when we're lending money to you, you're a safe bet.
Well, so what you're saying, that GNP is downstream of GDP, like that?
Well, it's a different measure of how you look at the wealth. So the GDP is the wealth of the nation. That's what they say. GNP per capita is the wealth of the individuals within that nation.
Right.
And the way that GNP per capita is basically GDP, your total, what is your household income, including your house. So if you've got a house and a pension, and let's say it's all $1 million and it's just you, your own GNP per capita matches your GDP. It's $1 million because it's just one of you. Mm. But as soon as you get married and have children, your wealth has declined because there's now 4 of you. Mm-hmm. So GNP per capita says you've got 4, but actually it's now 250,000 each. It's not quite identical to that analogy. But the main point is, as you increase more people into your economy, that wealth that you have, if you now imagine putting 100 people in your house is still the same value, but the income that you've got to feed everyone suddenly means you've got less to spend on clothes.
Yep.
That's what's happening with ordinary people.
Right. So we should focus on GNP rather than...
I've been arguing this now for 10 years, and everyone says, shut up, Stephen, the GDP is more important. It's actually, to be fair, over the last 18 months...
It's more conducive to the set of policies they want to...
But
we are a bit tight on time, so we probably...
So we'll go into this briefly. I just want you to listen to this because I'm looking at the time.
Growth and migration.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sam. Just succinctly, and then adding to the answer I just gave. Firstly, the pure theory, if you like, that simply higher migration numbers necessarily leads to higher growth, I think has been tested in the last 4 years. We quadrupled in actually a very short period of time. And, you know, I think whatever political persuasion you are, it is quite extraordinary that net migration quadrupled in 4 years. We've never seen that before in this country, but growth didn't shift. It stayed stagnant. Secondly, this point about...
Finally, we have a Prime Minister who is actually saying GDP has not grown.
That is a bit of a watershed moment, actually.
And that is actually a major, but most people haven't picked up on this. And I find it, you know, there you are, a bunch of journalists from all the major newspapers and TV shows haven't picked up on the fact that here we have a Prime Minister for the first time in 20 years has accepted.
And it was the argument for 20 years that was the reason we had to do it, although I'm not that hung up about it because they just pivot to a new reason.
And I probably will. But this is crucial, and I think it gives us an opportunity now to hammer down on them.
Yes, we should do.
Hammer down on them to say, we now have proof from your own lips that what you've been saying for the last 20 years is incorrect, and we should be able to focus on what really matters, which is the individual wealth and well-being of the people of this country.
Absolutely.
And mass migration is not making us richer.
But then as Dan said, then they'll just start talking about humanitarian reasons and it'll be back and it'll be Red Nose Day in the 80s. And all
Which
that.
is why I'm pivoting back to the beginning of this. This is why Khan has emphasised these numbers on skilled workers to say they're better, or skilled workers good, home workers bad.
If you would like to watch the full uncut version that is also uncensored, head on over to lotuseaters.com to find out more.